Good morning. Uh, I'm really just kind of playing around right now, trying to settle in the best mode for communicating with you. Normally, I do the Bible studies on YouTube, but I think I've shared this before. It's sometimes a lot easier just to do it on Facebook and then copy it over to YouTube, than start with a camera on my phone and upload it to YouTube. So I just, the last minute this morning, set up the Facebook Live, knowing that there might be very few of you who are watching it live, but I have also found that it seems as if there's more people who watch it when it's directly on Facebook versus on YouTube. So I called an audible this morning and decided just to do it on Facebook Live. I like the live aspect a little bit better as well than just the YouTube upload. So with all that said, I welcome you to the Bible study. I very much enjoy this time. I enjoy the structure and also in preparation for the Sunday sermon, so it's helpful to me. I did upload the lessons. There's 2 pages that are there. I want you to notice on the very bottom, just to continue to add some variation to things. After our Bible study, which will be about 30 to 35 minutes, there's also some self-reflection time, if you would like. You could pick a lesson or do 2 lessons, however you want to do it, and there's a series of questions that are there. But maybe just start with 1 lesson, and then I want you to read the lesson slowly several times, keeping in mind the questions that you're going to answer. For those of you who have been a part of the Bible studies during the Lenten evenings, you'll know that that was something that we did quite regularly, and it really bore a lot of fruit. So I wanted to provide that as another opportunity today for a deepening of the Word of God. What I'm going to do this morning is focus on 2 of the lessons, 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 13, and then Mark's Gospel chapter 1. So I'm going to read 1 Corinthians 8:13, 1 through 13, and then we'll get into Mark's Gospel. So let's just jump right into it. Now, concerning food sacrificed to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Anyone who claims to know something does not yet have the necessary knowledge, but anyone who loves God is known by him. Hence, as to the eating of food offered to idols, we know that no idol in the world really exists, and that there is no God but one. Indeed, even though there may be so-called gods in heaven or on earth, as in fact there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom all things and from whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all are things and through whom we exist. It is not everyone, however, who has this knowledge, since some have become so accustomed to food until now, they still think of food they eat as food offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Food will not bring us close to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat, and no better off if we do. But take care that this liberty of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. For if others see you, who possess knowledge, eating in the temple of an idol, might they not, since their conscience is weak, be encouraged to the point of eating food sacrificed to idols? So by your knowledge, those weak believers for whom Christ died are destroyed. But when you thus sin against members of your family and wound their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore, food is the cause of their falling. I will never eat meat, so that I may not cause one of them to fall. Excuse me, I had to grab my pen real fast off the floor. I did open up my Bible just to see how this passage fits into the larger context of 1 Corinthians. I have previously commented that sometimes the lectionary passages are really chopped out of sections, and it would be nice to have a little bit more filled in Well, I was much relieved to notice, at least in my Bible, this section immediately before our passage, which is titled Food Offered to Idols, comes the section The Unmarried and the Widows. And then it moves into another topic. You'll notice in verse 1 it says, "Now concerning the sacrifice to idols," that is a teaching transition. So in this passage of this letter to Corinth, Paul is addressing specific issues that came to his attention through letters, other letters sent from Corinth. And he's responding back to these questions. And I'm sure there was a question that his community had said, hey, so what about food that is offered to idols? What should we do with that, Paul? Well, then Paul moves into the topic. And notice that very throwaway word "now." So you can see he's saying, okay, now concerning, and to think that he's picking up a particular question. That then continues all the way through 13, and then it moves into chapter 9, the rights of the apostle, 9:1. So all that to say is that the lectionary is in a very, at least to me, the topic is fully contained within our lessons for Sunday. So that kind of made me feel good. So let me jump in. So my reflection is a compilation of notes. Primarily, this passage comes from Valerie Anderson, at least some of the notes, and then some of my seminary notes that are interspersed, and then my various ramblings. But I like to make sure that I credit where some of the information comes from. This lesson gives us access to concrete situations in Paul's community and gives us some sense of how Paul thought and what he decided to put first in his dealings with his communities. For the community in Corinth, the problem is as follows. Once the animals were sacrificed during pagan rituals, the extra meat was sold in markets. As a Christ believer living in Corinth, couldn't one buy and eat this meat? All right, isn't that wonderful? I mean, that's so well stated. That is the issue. And I think about our lives today, or different, very specific questions that we have about a life of faith. And this was that question. Now, this is not our question today. I have never, ever thought of this other than, of course, reading this lesson. But in this time and place, in this time of Paul, this was something that was a question. And then to think about what are our questions today? Different than this, but there's still questions that we have to practical life events, daily things that happen in the daily grind, and how that relates to our faith in God. So I really appreciated that very focused in question that this community has. So Corinth, as you know, was known in the first century as a quintessential pagan town. And it would have been difficult for Christ believers in Corinth to live in a manner completely separate from the world around them. When Paul deals with the community, he always tries to establish a behavior that takes into account both the fact that the Christ believers live inside the world, but also clearly separate from it. And there it is again, another very profound statement. That is our tension as Christians living in our community. That we understand that we have behaviors that are all surrounding us. We might even not even realize how we're caught up in those sometimes improper behaviors that go against the teachings of Jesus. We don't wake up one morning and say, I'm going to intentionally ignore this teaching, but it just sort of happens because we get caught up in things. So Paul is a realist. He's not believing that we can completely isolate ourselves on these little Christian islands, as some maybe Christian communities today try to do. But he says, and this lesson it's a specific question, but what the teaching is going to provide us is an answer to other specific questions that we may have by learning the answer to this specific question. So let's see what that answer is. The passage Paul gives us is a glimpse in the manner in which Paul understood the world, and in particular the space between God and human beings. So this is where this big picture teaching, this big picture answer, once we have that answer, we're going to be able to take that answer and then move it into specific questions that we have. And that's powerful, very powerful. One sees first from 1 Corinthians 8, 4 through 5. So you can mark that down and go back. That Paul is aware that in the world surrounding him there are plenty of gods and lords. And in this case, he was probably thinking of the pagan gods and heroes, although Judaism also had its categories of beings between God and human beings, angels and also demons. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 20 through 21, Paul actually explicitly identifies these gods and heroes with demons. Paul does not give credence to these gods, since for him and for other Jewish people with him, there is only one God. Yet he recognizes that these gods are here, even though they play no role for him. It seems that for some of the Corinthians at least, knowing that these gods and heroes are not the true one God was sufficient to allow them to eat sacrificed meat without feeling guilty about it. Right? So, hey, sure, there's maybe other gods out there, but or thought to be, but there's one God. And so I know my place, I know my status with this one God. And so I'm not going to concern myself with that. Yet, and here's the practical Paul, and why we're still reading his letters today. Well, they're in the Bible, but how we can still talk about them and find meaning from them. How we can take a specific situation that is not our problem today, learn about it, and then move it into the specific questions that we have. I keep repeating myself here. So he recognizes that these gods are here, even though they play no role for him. It seems that for some of the Corinthians at least, I already stated that. So one can tell that this is also, in fact, Paul's position. Since these gods are not the one true God, eating meat that had been dedicated to these gods is indifferent. It does not prejudice to the God of Israel. So, as Paul is eating these meats, he's not worshiping these other gods. He's just eating meat because his body needs meat. It's irrelevant to him that these were sacrificed to these gods because they're not gods. There's only one God. So that's why in his own strength, his own sense of place, it's not affecting me. Now, let's get into the topic of knowledge. That's certainly a big thing that we pursue today, knowledge versus wisdom, right? Who has knowledge? What is it? However, Paul does not establish this knowledge as something that is the ultimate criterion to decide of how to behave. Paul never conceives of the Christ believer as an independent individual who would take decisions that involve him or herself only, quite contrary to the fact. For Paul, the Christ believers are first and foremost involved in a community. So, this is not just about specific answers to only specific individuals, but what Paul is most concerned about is how the individuals are affecting the community. They are enmeshed in a network of relationships that connect them to other Christ believers. This interconnectedness is precisely the ultimate criterion for Paul. How one's behavior will influence the behavior of others is paramount. So, as I had said, we study these lessons to learn what is sort of the big picture teaching that comes out of a specific question. And what I want us to leave here today, I want to restate it, is that one of the major lessons that we get that can be translated into our specific situations in the year 2021 is that how one's individual behavior influences the behaviors of others is paramount. I remember, gosh, it must have been back in, I don't know, April or May, I think. It's still online. It's on YouTube, and I believe it's still on our webpage. I did clean up our webpage a little bit because there's just so many videos there. But it's definitely there, still on our YouTube channel. But anyway, it was talking about the freedom of a Christian. What does it mean to be free? And then we tied that into individual freedoms that we have. This was coming out of the whole thing with vaccines and masks. You know, do I have the right to not wear a mask? And, you know, quite frankly, for me, it was not an issue because maybe I learned this sort of statement early in my development of faith, that what's most important, what my framework is, and I struggle doing it, but I have a framework, is that my individual rights, I will first try to put them aside if it's going to benefit others. I don't do that all the time. I know that about myself, but at least I have a framework. We have a framework to come back to, which is why it might have been frustrating for us when the whole mask thing, it was very obvious. So just wear a mask. What's the big deal, right? If it's gonna help others, help them out. I could strap it on, and others were like, no, it's my individual right not to. And there was this, tension. Well, here is the reason why there was a tension, to give some explanation to it. The next section, before we jump into the gospel, this is restating something we know, but it needs to be restated anyway. And this is that big picture teaching once again, that love is the ultimate criterion in our moral life and decisions that we make as we live in community. So love for the community, what is surmised under the word agape in Greek, the sacrificial love, are the things that should guide our individual actions. The Christ believer's freedom is limited first of all because the Christ believers belong to Christ and are enslaved to Christ, but also because they're a part of a community. In this community, it is the opinion of the ones less certain in their faith that need to orient everyone's decisions. And this is indeed how love should be understood in the Christ believers' communities. Love in this context, as we know, is not romantic feelings, but it is also not some sweet, affectionate type of feeling. Love, when it comes to community, is an active feeling that must be translated into acts and actions rather than in good feelings towards the others. For Paul, love in community does not necessarily mean that you have to like the other people in the community, or that you have to agree with the other people in the community, but that you need to love them, that you need to do what is best for them. You and I, you know this, I'm teaching to the choir. I'm not quite sure who all will be watching this since you're not in front of me. But maybe we needed to be reminded of this. And that's really what the word is. It's not always learning something new, but it's being reminded of the things that we need to do. And that's very refreshing for me this morning to be able to share those things. Okay. A little bit more than 10 minutes left. I want to spend some time in Mark's Gospel. I often say in these Bible studies what I'm hoping to do, and I rarely get to what I thought I was going to, but I might actually be able to do that. Mark chapter 1, verses 21 through 28. Jesus and his disciples went to Capernaum. And when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Just then, there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were amazed, and they kept asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." At once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. Now remember that Jesus, very early on in his ministry, and we certainly see this in Mark's total gospel, is in Galilee, and that's in the northern part. His Passion Week, of course, is further south, and that is in Judea, in Jerusalem. There are many of you watching this today that were blessed to be able to travel to the Holy Land, and so these towns and cities and Galilee and the lakes and the Dead Sea, Jerusalem, the city. So you have a visual sense of what the land looks like, and I would think that you're richer in your faith because of it. Now, just as I had said, I took a peek for 1 Corinthians to see where our passage falls within the larger context. I was very touched and enlightened and happy. Last week we had from Mark chapter 1, Jesus calling his first disciples. That was Mark 1:14 through 20. And I'll end where we ended last week. Immediately he called them, Jesus called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. Okay, that ended. Now we pick up in verse 21. They went to Capernaum, and then when the Sabbath came. So last week's ending gospel moves right into this week's opening, which is great. So it's kind of that. Usually it jumps around, but I always like that. Maybe because I'm linear sometimes in my thinking. So let's look at some of the details of this. It's not a very large text. You'll probably notice that they're shorter. Last week's lessons were very short in the lectionary, and Mark certainly is as well. So possessed by the Holy Spirit, fresh from successfully confronting Satan in the wilderness, preaching the reign of God, and now in the company of at least 4 followers. So his followers are ramping up. It's time for Jesus' public ministry to gain momentum. And that place is the beginning, is in the synagogue, a setting for prayer, teaching, worship, and community gathering, which centers around the question, so this is one of the takeaways for our study today. Just as we had some fundamental questions of Paul, the question now that this text reveals is about Jesus' authority. Who is this person? What authority does he have to teach the things that he teaches? People will only listen to people over a long period of time if those people believe that those people that are speaking have the authority to do so. So again, you may not have thought about this, how we listen to people. Subconsciously or consciously, we make those decisions based upon the authority that we give them or that they have. And this is very much this question. Also, another question is the authority, and that comes out of another question: who has authorized his ministry? So we can say that if Jesus' ministry was authorized by the Father, that then gives Jesus the authority, and that people will listen to him. So that's what these early parts of Mark's trying to figure out who this person is. He's got 4 followers with him now, and he's out there beginning his public ministry. He is that new pastor on the block, and people are kind of like, kind of scoping him out a little bit, trying to get a feel for what this guy's all about. Let's talk about the authorized exorcist, because I know there might be some interest in, sort of that exorcism and spirits. These are questions we all have. Demons. It's not just youth, but I think all of us have some wonderments about that. So the man with the unclean spirit finds Jesus, initiating this exchange. So he finds Jesus. His opening question asked by the spirit that possesses him. It conveys really a sense of kind of like, in terms of an idiom, so why are you picking this fight? Or couldn't you just have left things as they once were? That's sort of an idiomatic way of setting this dialogue between the unclean spirit and Jesus, right? So Jesus, by his sheer presence in the synagogue, has upset the order. So it's really the synagogue leaders are the ones who are asking those questions. Why are you doing this? Why are you kind of stirring things up? But the contest does not last very long, for this is not the fairest of fights in terms of strength of those who are battling. We can't be sure whether the Spirit's next question, "Have you come to destroy us?" is a fearful acknowledgement that his doom is sealed, or an arrogant but miscalculated boast. But in any case, the Spirit, though, is soon gone, expelled from the man with a few words from Jesus. Notice, there's no prayers, there's no formulas, there's no props. He just simply commands, and they're gone. Mark gives no information about what happens to the Spirit, which appears to become disembodied, but not destroyed. So remember, that Spirit was embodied, and now it's disembodied, so the question is kind of, where does it go? So the New Testament is a somewhat unique among the ancient Jewish literature in its attention to the demon being possessing of someone, or a demon attacking somebody. When Jesus strips the spirits of the ability to inhabit the human host, perhaps the Gospel's authors claim that Jesus denies the unclean spirits the capabilities to have a settled place, or to be entrenched in the world. I kind of think of that in some ways as what we're going through with the virus, right? That the virus only lives when it's able to be embodied in somebody. And right now I was reading something that there's a calculation that 1/3 of the United States population has either had the virus, and so there's this whole thing about that herd immunity you might have heard about, that if we can build up people that, actually before the vaccine, but 70% of people having the virus, then the virus can't be jumping around because it can't attach itself to that person because they have the antibodies. And so the virus just goes away. Well, I was thinking about this in the study this morning, that's kind of similar to this, that an evil spirit only has power when it's able to be embodied in somebody. And then that opens up a whole sort of thing of kind of allowing spirits in by our life, and so I'm not going to go down that path. But anyway, it was kind of an interesting parallel, I think, to what we're experiencing with this COVID-19 virus. So it's just interesting to sort of look at the way that this plays out with the demon. But the point is that there's a command, and the spirit is actually disembodied, and then we don't have any more information. It's gone. It's gone out of that person. So Jesus continues to move on. Now, final thing, and then we're going to end, is I want to talk about, because the question was by what authority are you doing these things? So let's talk about Jesus as the authorized teacher. The crowd's amazement about the exorcism resonates with its reaction to Jesus' teaching at the beginning of this passage. That Jesus was permitted to teach in a synagogue is not remarkable in itself. What captures attention is the manner of his teaching. All right, so that's a really significant part of this text. It's not that he was teaching in the synagogue, other people have taught, it's what he's teaching. Mark says Jesus teaches as, quote, one having authority, and takes a dig at the credentials Jewish legal experts ascribes in the process. This doesn't instigate a full-fledged fight, that comes later, but it issues a challenge. Apparently, Jesus' teaching style is more in actually declaring something rather than perhaps thinking about it or merely postulating. He's not saying, I wonder if, Jesus is, just like he commanded that spirit, Jesus is making some very declarative statements. And that, again, gets the ire of the synagogue leaders. That is, he interprets the law and speaks on behalf of God without engaging in much dialogue about traditions, as the scribes were known to do. This seems in line with other places in Mark where Jesus speaks about newness. That's in chapter 2, verses 21 through 22, and where he claims the authority to make assertions about the way the things are in 2:28 and 10:5. So the teachings and the exorcism are connected then, since both result in amazement and acclamations about Jesus' authority. So see that? Please read chapters 1 and 2 when we're done, even to 3. Notice about the setting up of the authority. Who are you? And who do you think you are? That's a statement that we've asked people when they're, a little maybe pushy or making these statements. Like, who do you think you are that you can come in here? I mean, that's what we're saying. By what authority do you have to come in and make these statements? So teaching and exorcism both have immediate effects, and both issue claims about who Jesus is. Inquiries into Jesus' authority are inquiries into his identity. That's what we said. Mark is just getting warmed up for these kinds of questions will resurface. Mark these down here if you have a pen. And then go back and see how that questioning of authority continues, like I said. Mark chapter 2, verses 5 through 12. Mark chapter 3, verse 15. Mark 19, 22. No, excuse me. I scratched that. So Mark 2, 5 through 12. Mark 3, verse 15. And then 19 through 22 of chapter 3. Mark chapter 4, verse 41. Mark chapter 6, verses 2 through 3. And then finally, Mark 8:11. Okay, you could always go back and rewind that if you want. So here's the final statement. Eventually, the question of Jesus' authority is he really sent by God? Will figure into his death, beginning with the questions put to him in, write this down, Mark 11:28, and continuing through his sham trial before the high priest and then Pilate. Remember Pilate? And then he's actually identified as the King of the Jews. So it's really cool to study these early parts of a gospel because it's setting up the foundation for what follows. And once you know some of the themes, and we've hit on a couple of the themes in Mark's gospel, you're then more attentive to when you read the rest of the gospel and then see how it kind of falls all the way through the end of Mark. So that is all that I have for today. Thank you for watching, and I appreciate you participating in this, and have a great day. Bye-bye.